Delegates from 17 different species filled the crystalline amphitheater, their various forms of communication creating a symphony of clicks, warbles, telepathic whispers, and bioluminescent flashes that all conveyed the same sentiment: incredulous laughter. At the center of it all stood Ambassador Elena Vasquez, representing the newest member of the Galactic community, humanity. "Honorable delegates," Elena began, her voice steady despite the obvious mockery rippling through. "The Assembly, I come before you today to discuss the recent misunderstanding regarding the human vessel Serenity's Edge." The Zephyrian delegate, a towering crystalline being whose faceted surface refracted light in patterns that indicated extreme mirth, chimed in with sounds like wind through crystal caves. "Misunderstanding? Your species claims this tiny craft somehow neutralized an entire Kethvar raiding fleet. 12 heavy cruisers, Ambassador. Ships that have terrorized 3 sectors for decades." Elena's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. She had anticipated this reaction. When the report first came through diplomatic channels, even she had doubted its veracity. The Serenity's Edge was, by galactic standards, laughably small, barely 300 meters from bow to stern. Most cargo haulers dwarfed it. The average Galactic Council patrol vessel was twice its size, and the Kethvar heavy cruisers it had allegedly defeated were each over 2 kilometers of armored depth. "I understand your skepticism," Elena replied, activating her holographic display. The image of the Serenity's Edge materialized above the assembly, a sleek, angular vessel that looked more like an oversized fighter than a proper warship. "But I assure you, the reports are accurate. All 12 Kethvar vessels were disabled without a single human casualty." The laughter grew louder. The Manthari representative, a collective consciousness housed in a writhing mass of tentacles and bioelectric nodes, pulsed with patterns of deep blue and green, their equivalent of hysterical amusement. "Disabled? The Kethvar vessels were found completely intact but powerless, their crews in some form of neural stasis. Your little ship did this with what weapons exactly? We've analyzed its specifications. It carries no plasma cannons, no gravitational disruptors, no quantum torpedoes." "That's correct," Elena nodded. "The Serenity's Edge carries no conventional weapon systems." "Then how?" began the Vorthak delegate, a reptilian creature whose scales shifted color with emotion. Currently, they displayed the mottled yellow-green of confusion mixed with contempt. "Before I explain," Elena interrupted, "I'd like to share some context about human naval traditions. You see, we come from a water world, and for millennia, our greatest vessels sailed across vast oceans. These ships had names that carried weight, history, and sometimes warnings." The assembly quieted slightly, curious despite themselves. Few species understood humans' peculiar attachment to naming their vessels, much less the significance behind those names. "Ships like the Dreadnought, the Invincible, or the Unsinkable Titanic," Elena continued, noting how the universal translators struggled with some of the concepts. "But humans learned something important from our maritime history. Sometimes the most dangerous ships don't advertise their capabilities. Sometimes they bear names that seem almost peaceful." She paused, letting the silence stretch. "The Serenity's Edge was named after a human concept, the thin line between perfect calm and absolute chaos. You see, honored delegates, you've been asking the wrong question. You ask what weapons it carries. But you should be asking, what makes it dangerous?" The Corithian delegate, whose kind communicated through controlled gravitational pulses, sent a wave of inquiry through the chamber. "Elaborate, human," Elena smiled, the first genuine smile she'd shown since entering the chamber. "The danger isn't in its weapons, Corithian commander of the 7th Fleet. The danger is in its crew, specifically its captain." "One human?" The Zephyrian's chimes took on a note of disbelief. One human against an entire raiding fleet? Not just any human, Elena said, her voice dropping to barely above a whisper, forcing the entire assembly to lean forward. Captain Marcus Ghost Reeves. Tell me, delegates, in all your vast databases of galactic military history, have you ever encountered a human who earned the call sign Ghost? The chamber fell silent as delegates accessed their information networks. Elena could see the exact moment when the search results began filtering through. The subtle changes in posture, the shifting of bioluminescent patterns, the cessation of telepathic chatter. Impossible, breathed the Manthari collective. These records, they cannot be accurate. Oh, but they are, Elena replied. Marcus Reeves, age 47, former captain of the Earth Defense Force stealth frigate Phantom's Whisper, participated in the Centauri conflicts, the Proxima Station incident, and 17 other classified operations. Military records sealed, but his reputation, well, that's another matter entirely. She gestured, and the hologram shifted, showing a grainy image of a man with steel-gray hair and eyes the color of deep space. Captain Reeves earned his call sign not for his stealth technology, though the Serenity's edge does carry the most. Advanced cloaking systems ever developed by human science. He earned it because of what he does to enemy crews. Which is? The Vorthax scales now showed deep purple, the color of unease. Elena's smile widened, but there was no warmth in it. He makes them disappear. Not their ships, not their bodies, their minds. Marcus Reeves is humanity's premier psychological warfare specialist. When the Cathvar raiders thought they were engaging a simple human cargo vessel, they had no idea. They were about to face a man who could turn their own thoughts against them. The chamber erupted in a cacophony of disbelief and demands for explanation. Elena raised her hand for silence. The Serenity's edge doesn't need weapons, honorable delegates. It carries something far more dangerous. An expert in the one thing every sentient species shares, fear. Captain Reeves has spent 30 years learning how different minds break, how consciousness fractures under the right pressure, and how to apply that pressure with surgical precision. She activated another hologram, showing the interior of one of the Kethvar vessels. The crew was found in their stations, eyes wide open, but seeing nothing. Their minds trapped in carefully constructed psychological loops that left them aware but helpless. But how? The question came from the ethereal collective, beings of pure thought who rarely spoke in council sessions. Our minds are shielded, protected by psychic barriers evolved over millions of years. Ah, Elena said, but that's where you underestimate human ingenuity. We may not have natural telepathic abilities, but we've had thousands of years to study the mind from the outside in. We understand psychology not as an innate gift, but as a science. And Captain Reeves has turned that science into an art form. The silence that followed was heavy with a new kind of understanding. The laughter had died completely, replaced by something far more troubling, respect mixed with fear. You see, Elena continued, when the Kethvar opened communications with the Serenity's edge, expecting to demand surrender, they instead heard Captain Reeves's voice. And in that voice, he carried something that transcended species barriers, something that spoke directly to the deepest, most primal fears of any conscious being. He spoke of the void between stars, of the crushing loneliness of space, of the fragility of consciousness itself. The Galactic Council members shifted uncomfortably. They were beginning to understand that they had vastly underestimated not just the ship, but the species it represented. The Kethvar, fierce as they are, found their minds invaded not by foreign thoughts, but by their own deepest terrors, carefully cultivated and amplified by a master of psychological manipulation. Captain Reeves didn't defeat them with firepower. He defeated them with understanding. He knew exactly which mental pressure points to press to render them helpless. Elena deactivated the holograms and faced the assembly directly. So, yes, honored delegates, the Serenity's Edge may look like nothing more than a small human vessel. But appearances, as we humans say, can be deceiving. When you hear that ship's name announced, when you hear Captain Reeves's voice over the communications array, you're not just encountering a vessel and its crew. You're facing 30 years of human warfare evolution concentrated into one man and one ship. The chamber remained silent for a long moment. Finally, the Corithian delegate sent a gravitational pulse that translated as a formal inquiry. What, Ambassador Vasquez, does humanity want from this council? Elena's expression shifted subtly, and those delegates sensitive to micro-expressions noticed the change immediately. The diplomatic mask she'd worn throughout the session cracked just enough to reveal something underneath. Something that made the temperature in the chamber seem to drop by several degrees. "Want?" she repeated, her voice taking on a tone that hadn't been there before. "Honored delegates, I think there's been a fundamental misunderstanding about why I'm here today." She touched her wrist communicator, and suddenly the chamber's main display activated, showing real-time feeds from across the galaxy. The delegates watched in growing horror as the images revealed scene after scene of devastation, not the clean, surgical precision they might expect from human psychological warfare, but something far worse. 3 days ago, while you were all drafting your amusing responses to humanity's impossible claims about the Serenity's Edge, Captain Reeves received new orders, Elena continued, her voice now carrying the weight of inevitability. You see, the Kethvar raid wasn't an isolated incident. Our intelligence networks, which I'm sure you'll be shocked to learn, are far more extensive than any of you realized, intercepted communications indicating that the attack was a test. The Zephyrian delegate's crystalline structure began resonating, with frequencies indicating distress. A test? For what purpose? Elena gestured to the displays. To see how humanity would respond to aggression, to gauge our military capabilities, to determine whether we were worth conquering or merely exterminating. The images on the screens shifted, showing the distinctive architecture of various council member worlds. But these weren't promotional tourism feeds, these were tactical reconnaissance photographs, detailed enough to identify defensive positions, population centers, and strategic vulnerabilities. The test was commissioned by a coalition of council members, Elena continued, her words falling like hammer blows. Species who believed that humanity's rapid technological advancement posed a threat to the established galactic order. The Drakmari, hegemony, the Thessarian Empire, and yes, her gaze fixed on specific delegates, even representatives of 3 species sitting in this very chamber. The chamber erupted in denials and protests, but Elena's voice cut through the chaos like a blade. The Serenity's Edge didn't just neutralize the Kethvar raiders. Captain Reeves extracted every piece of information from their minds before leaving them in their catatonic states. Every communication, every payment, every secret meeting that led to that attack. She paused, letting the implications sink in. But here's where it gets interesting. You wanted to test humanity's response to aggression? Congratulations, you've succeeded beyond your wildest nightmares. The main display now showed a star chart of the galaxy, with small red dots appearing across multiple sectors. As the delegates watched, the dots began to multiply. Dozens, then hundreds, then thousands. Each red dot represents a human vessel currently in position around your worlds, Elena explained with clinical precision. Not warships, you understand? We learned long ago that traditional military might is crude and inefficient. These are ships like the Serenity's Edge, small, unassuming vessels crewed by specialists in fields you've never even considered as warfare disciplines. The Manthari Collective's bioelectric patterns were now flashing in rapid, panicked sequences. Impossible. Our sensor networks would have detected such a massive deployment. Elena's smile was razor-thin. Would they? Tell me. Have any of your worlds reported unusual increases in tourism lately? Academic exchange programs? Cultural missions? Humanitarian aid shipments? The silence that followed was deafening. Elena could practically see the mental calculations happening as delegates accessed their planetary databases, cross-referencing the timing of various seemingly innocent human activities. You see, while you were laughing at our little ship, humanity was already 3 moves ahead. Every human vessel that entered your territories over the past 6 months wasn't just carrying diplomats or scientists or aid workers. They were carrying specialists, psychologists like Captain Reeves, xenobiologists who understand your species better than you understand yourselves, social engineers who can predict and manipulate societal responses, information warfare experts who can turn your own communication networks against you. The Vorthak delegates' scales had shifted to deep black, the color of terror. You're describing an invasion fleet disguised as diplomatic missions. No, Elena corrected. I'm describing something far more sophisticated than an invasion. Invasions are messy, expensive, and ultimately unsustainable. What humanity has deployed is something entirely different. A network of surgical instruments positioned to perform the most precise form of warfare ever conceived. She activated another control, and the display showed detailed psychological profiles of each species in the chamber. Not general species characteristics, individual psychological breakdowns of the specific delegates present. For instance, Elena continued conversationally, Zephyrian Commander 3rd Resonance, our specialists have determined that your species' crystalline consciousness structure makes you particularly vulnerable to harmonic disruption. A specific frequency, broadcast at precisely 847.3 terahertz, would cause cascading resonance failure throughout your neural matrix. You'd remain conscious, but completely unable to form coherent thoughts. The Zephyrians' harmonics became discordant with fear. Elena turned to the next delegate. Manthari Collective Node 7. Your distributed consciousness is remarkably resilient to conventional psychological attack. But your species has one fascinating weakness: existential isolation anxiety. If the bioelectric connections between your individual nodes were disrupted for exactly 7.3 seconds, your collective consciousness would fragment permanently. Each fragment would retain full awareness but be forever cut off from the others. The Manthari Collective's tentacles writhed in distress. Elena continued her circuit of the chamber. Vorthak Prime Scale Bearer. Your species' hierarchical social structure makes you exquisitely vulnerable to authority confusion protocols. A carefully crafted series of contradictory commands from perceived authority figures would trap your decision-making processes in recursive loops, leaving you aware but paralyzed by indecision. She paused in front of the ethereal collectives, representatives. And you, beings of pure thought, you believed your non-corporeal nature made you invulnerable to human psychological warfare. But consciousness, regardless of its substrate, follows certain universal patterns. Our specialists have developed thought viruses specifically designed to exploit the recursive nature of pure consciousness. Self-referential paradoxes that would trap your awareness in infinite loops of self-examination. The chamber was now filled with a palpable sense of dread. Elena returned to the center of the amphitheater, her diplomatic facade completely abandoned. But here's the truly terrifying part, she continued. Everything I've just described, the psychological profiles, the species-specific vulnerabilities, the surgical precision attacks, that's just Captain Reeves's specialty. He's only one of humanity's psychological warfare experts. The display shifted again, showing personnel files. Dozens of human faces appeared, each with their own specialized skill sets. Meet Dr. Sarah Chen, specialist in mimetic warfare. She can introduce ideas into your information networks that will spread like viruses, subtly altering your entire civilization's belief structures. Or Commander James Rodriguez, expert in temporal psychological manipulation. He can make your perception of time dilate or compress until minutes feel like years and years feel like seconds. More faces appeared. Captain Lisa Thompson, Master of Social Dynamics Warfare. She can identify the precise social tensions within your civilizations and amplify them until your own populations tear your societies apart from within. Dr. Michael O'Brien, specialist in existential horror. He can make you question the very nature of reality until you're paralyzed by the certainty that nothing you perceive is real. Elena gestured to the star chart. Each red dot represents not just a ship, but a weapon more precise and devastating than anything you've ever encountered. And right now, they're all in position, waiting. The Corinthian delegate sent a gravitational pulse so powerful it rattled equipment throughout the chamber. The translation was barely coherent. "What? What do you want from us?" Elena's expression softened slightly, returning to something resembling diplomatic normalcy. "Now you're asking the right question, but you're still making an incorrect assumption." "Which is?" "You assume that humanity wants something from you, that we're here to negotiate, to make demands, to extract concessions." Elena shook her head slowly. "But you orchestrated an attack against us. You tested us. You wanted to see what we were, capable of when threatened." The silence stretched unbearably. "Well," Elena continued, "now you know. The question isn't what humanity wants from the Galactic Council. The question is, what is humanity going to do about the fact that sitting members of this council conspired to have us attacked? The implications hit the delegates like a physical blow. Several species began rapid communications with their homeworlds, undoubtedly trying to coordinate some form of defense or retaliation. "I wouldn't bother," Elena said calmly, somehow detecting their communications attempts. "You see, while we've been having this pleasant conversation, Captain Reeves has been busy. The psychological conditioning he applied to the Kethvar raiders included post-hypnotic triggers, specific phrases that, when broadcast on predetermined frequencies, would activate dormant psychological programs." She paused, letting the horror of the implication build. "Those raiders you captured for interrogation, the ones your intelligence services have been questioning for the past 3 days. Every time they heard certain words during those interrogation sessions, they were transmitting activation codes, codes that have been received by every human operative positioned throughout your territories. The display now showed real-time status updates from across the galaxy. Green lights were turning red with systematic precision. Phase 1 of humanity's response is now active," Elena announced. "In the next 6 hours, every world that participated in the conspiracy against humanity will begin experiencing what we call cascading social breakdown. Nothing violent, nothing that could be traced back to external interference. Your own populations will simply start coming apart." She gestured to specific readouts. "The Drakmari will find that their rigid caste system suddenly seems arbitrary and oppressive to the lower castes. The Thessarians will discover that their collective decision-making processes have become hopelessly deadlocked over minor procedural issues. And the 3 council member species who funded the Kethvar attack will find that their governmental structures are mysteriously unable to function." The terror in the chamber was now absolute. Elena continued with clinical detachment. "This is what human warfare looks like when we're not constrained by diplomatic niceties. We don't conquer worlds, we make them conquer themselves. We don't destroy civilizations, we convince them to destroy themselves. We don't impose our will through force, we make you want to comply." The Zephyrian delegate's harmonics were barely above a whisper. How do we stop this?" Elena tilted her head, considering the question. "Stop it? Oh, you misunderstand. This isn't a threat you can negotiate away or a demand you can meet. This is consequences. You tested humanity's response to aggression, and this is the result." She turned to address the chamber as a whole. "However, humanity is not without mercy. Phase 1 will continue for exactly 72 hours. During that time, you'll experience just enough social disruption to understand what we're capable of. After 72 hours, the psychological triggers will deactivate automatically. A collective sigh of relief began to sweep the chamber, but Elena's next words cut it short. Unless, of course, any member of the conspiracy attempts to retaliate. During that 72-hour period, any aggressive action, any attempt to attack human vessels, any effort to harm human civilians, any act of war against humanity or our interests, will result in the activation of Phase 2. And Phase 2 is... Elena's smile was terrible to behold. Phase 2 is permanent. Phase 2 is what Captain Reeves calls the long dream. Psychological conditioning so profound and complete that entire civilizations would simply stop. Not die, not suffer, just stop. Stop thinking, stop growing, stop existing as anything. More than biological machines going through the motions of life, while their minds are trapped in carefully constructed fantasy worlds. The chamber was silent except for the sound of various species' biological functions. Breathing, heartbeats, bioelectric pulses, all elevated by terror. But surely, the ethereal collective finally managed. There must be some way to... What? Elena interrupted. To undo this? To go back to the way things were? To pretend you never conspired to test humanity through violence? She shook her head. The old Galactic order is over. The one where established species could casually threaten newcomers to see what would happen. The one where might made right and the strong preyed on the weak. She gestured to the displays showing the global reach of human operations. Humanity didn't ask to be tested. We didn't seek this conflict, but you gave us one. And now you've learned something that should terrify you. Humans don't just win wars. We redefine what warfare means. Elena began gathering her materials, preparing to leave. The 72-hour period begins now. I suggest you use that time wisely, not to plan retaliation, but to consider what kind of galaxy you want to live in when this is over. Because when Phase 1 ends, humanity will be extending an invitation to every species in the galaxy to join a new kind of galactic community, one based on mutual respect rather than predatory testing. As she reached the chamber's exit, Elena turned back one final time. Oh, and delegates? If you're wondering whether other species will side with you against humanity when they learn what we're capable of, she smiled. They won't. Because by the time this is over, every civilization in the galaxy will understand one simple truth. It's far, far better to have humanity as an ally than to find out what happens when you make us your enemy. The chamber doors sealed behind her with a sound like the closing of a tomb, leaving the delegates alone with their terror and the slowly dawning realization that they had irrevocably changed the balance of power in the galaxy. 47 hours. Into humanity's 72-hour ultimatum, the galaxy was burning. Not with plasma fire or nuclear devastation, but with something far more insidious and terrifying. Across 17 different worlds, civilizations were tearing themselves apart from within, and the most horrifying aspect was that they couldn't understand why. Captain Marcus Ghost Reeves stood on the bridge of the Serenity's edge, watching. The tactical displays with the detached interest of a scientist observing a particularly elegant experiment. His ship hung in the void between stars, cloaked and invisible, monitoring the cascade of psychological warfare effects rippling across, the galaxy like dominoes falling in perfect sequence. "Status report, Dr. Chen," he said without turning from the displays. Dr. Sarah Chen, humanity's foremost expert in mimetic warfare, looked up from her console where streams of intercepted communications flowed like digital waterfalls. Phase I-1 is proceeding exactly as modeled, Captain. The Drakmari lower castes have begun questioning the fundamental assumptions of their social hierarchy. 3 major industrial complexes have gone offline due to work stoppages, and their governing council is deadlocked trying to address the sudden rebellious attitudes. Marcus nodded, his steel-gray eyes reflecting the cold light of distant stars. And the Thessarians? Even better than expected, Chen replied with professional satisfaction. Their collective decision-making processes have become so paralyzed by minor procedural disputes that they haven't been able to coordinate any significant governmental actions for 36 hours. Their parliament spent 14 hours yesterday debating the proper way to schedule a debate about scheduling debates. The conspiracy members? Chen's expression darkened slightly. The Vorthak are in complete governmental paralysis. Their authority structures are so confused that lower-ranking officials are receiving contradictory orders from 17 different superiors simultaneously. The Nexari Confederacy's trade networks have collapsed because their merchant class can't decide whether any transaction is authorized by the proper authorities. And the Kelthine... She paused, almost seeming to savor the moment. The Kelthine have convinced themselves that their own governmental communications are elaborate psychological attacks from an unknown enemy. They're essentially at war with their own bureaucracy. Marcus allowed himself a thin smile. Beautiful work. Any signs of retaliation attempts? 3 so far, all unsuccessful. Chen brought up tactical displays showing various sectors of space. The Drakmari dispatched a battle squadron toward the Sol system, but they turned back after 18 hours when the crews became convinced that their mission orders were part of an elaborate loyalty test designed to identify potential traitors. The Thessarian fleet never even left orbit. They're still debating whether the mobilization order was properly authorized. And the third? The Kelthine tried to launch a cyber attack against Earth's communication networks. Chen's smile was decidedly predatory. It lasted exactly 43 minutes before their own security protocols identified the attack as a possible infiltration attempt by their enemies and began countermeasures against their own cyber warfare division. Marcus turned from the displays to face his crew. The bridge of the Serenity's edge was smaller than most galactic vessels, but every station was occupied by a human who represented the pinnacle of their respective fields. These weren't soldiers in the traditional sense. They were artists, and their medium was the conscious mind. Dr. O'Brien? Marcus addressed a quiet man in the corner, whose console displayed what looked like abstract mathematical equations. How are our existential horror protocols performing? Dr. Michael O'Brien looked up with eyes that seemed to hold depths of cosmic understanding that were uncomfortable to look into directly. Remarkably well, Captain. The Nexari merchant class is experiencing what we might call reality dissociation cascades. They've become so uncertain about the nature of their own existence that they're unable to make any decisions more complex than basic survival functions. Elaborate. They've reached a state where they can no longer distinguish between their actual experiences and the possibility that those experiences might be elaborate simulations or psychological manipulations. Every sensation, every thought, every interaction has become suspect. They're functionally paralyzed by the certainty that nothing they perceive can be trusted. Marcus nodded approvingly. Commander Rodriguez? Temporal perception status? Commander James Rodriguez, a man whose presence seemed to subtly distort the flow of time around him, consulted readings that showed wave-like patterns across multiple dimensional axes. 7 Kelthine administrative centers are experiencing severe temporal dysphoria, Captain. Their bureaucrats are experiencing minutes as hours and hours as minutes. They can't coordinate any activities because their perception of time has become completely unreliable. Excellent. Captain Thompson, how are the social dynamics holding up? Captain Lisa Thompson, whose understanding of social structures bordered on the supernatural, gestured to a complex web of interconnected data points showing social network analyses. The cascading effects are actually accelerating beyond our initial projections, Captain. The targeted civilizations are beginning to experience secondary breakdown effects we didn't even specifically engineer. Their attempts to understand what's happening to them are creating additional social tensions that are amplifying the primary psychological triggers. Marcus raised an eyebrow. Meaning? Meaning they're making our job easier by trying to solve the problem. Every investigation they launch into the sudden social breakdowns creates more confusion and paranoia. Every committee they form to address the crisis becomes another vector for the authority confusion protocols. Every expert they consult becomes another node in the recursive doubt cascades. In other words, Dr. Chen added, they're trapped in a psychological maze where every attempt to find an exit leads them deeper into the labyrinth. Marcus turned back to the tactical displays, but his expression had shifted from satisfaction to something more complex, almost philosophical. Dr. Yamato, bring up the deep analysis. A new voice spoke from a station that seemed to exist in a slight visual distortion, as if the space around it bent light differently. Dr. Kenji Yamato, humanity's premier expert in consciousness architecture, materialized more clearly as he activated his console. Captain, the psychological profiles we've constructed go far beyond simple warfare applications. We're seeing unprecedented insights into the fundamental nature of consciousness itself. The main display shifted to show complex three-dimensional models of neural activity patterns, but these weren't human brains. They were abstract representations of alien consciousness structures. Each species' response to our psychological warfare protocols has revealed core architectural principles of their consciousness, Dr. Yamato continued. The Zephyrians' crystalline thought structures, for instance, operate on resonance principles that make them exquisitely vulnerable to harmonic disruption, but also incredibly efficient at processing complex multidimensional problems. The Manthari collective consciousness achieves a form of true distributed intelligence that we're only beginning to understand. Marcus frowned. Are you suggesting we could learn from these species? More than that, Captain. I'm suggesting that our psychological warfare capabilities could be the foundation for something unprecedented in galactic history. True interspecies consciousness integration. The bridge fell silent except for the hum of various monitoring systems. Dr. Yamamoto's words carried implications that went far beyond military applications. Explain, Marcus said quietly. Consider what we've accomplished in 47 hours, Dr. Yamamoto began, his voice taking on the tone of a professor delivering a lecture that would reshape understanding. We've demonstrated the ability to understand, predict, and manipulate the fundamental psychological processes of 17 different species. We've mapped their consciousness architectures with unprecedented precision. We've identified the specific mental frameworks that define their civilizations. He gestured to the displays showing real-time psychological monitoring data from across the galaxy. But Marcus, what if instead of using this knowledge to break down their civilizations, we used it to integrate them? What if we could create hybrid consciousness structures that combine the best aspects of each species' mental architecture? Dr. Chen looked up sharply from her console. You're talking about engineered evolution of consciousness itself. Exactly. Dr. Yamamoto's eyes blazed with the fervor of discovery. Imagine combining Zephyrian resonance processing with Manthari, distributed intelligence, Vorthak hierarchical organization with human creative chaos. We could create new forms of consciousness that transcend the limitations of any single species. Marcus was silent for a long moment, processing the implications. And the ethical considerations? That's the beautiful part, Dr. Yamamoto replied. Everything we've learned suggests that consciousness wants to evolve, wants to transcend its current limitations. The psychological breakdowns we're observing aren't just responses to our warfare techniques. They're symptoms of consciousness structures that have reached their evolutionary dead ends. Commander Rodriguez leaned forward. You're suggesting that the galactic civilizations were stagnating? More than stagnating, Dr. Yamamoto confirmed. They were trapped in psychological frameworks that prevented further development. The Drakmari caste system the Thessarian collective paralysis, the Vorthak authority confusion. These aren't temporary vulnerabilities we've exploited. They're fundamental flaws in consciousness architecture that were keeping these species from reaching their full potential. Captain Thompson's social dynamics expertise suddenly clicked into place. That's why the secondary breakdown effects are happening. Their civilizations weren't just attacked, they were shown that their fundamental assumptions about reality were inadequate. Precisely. Dr. Yamato activated new displays showing theoretical consciousness evolution paths. What we've done is force these species to confront the limitations of their current consciousness structures. The psychological warfare is just the catalyst. The real effect is evolutionary pressure toward new forms of awareness. Marcus stared at the data, his mind racing through possibilities that staggered him. You're saying we haven't just defeated them. We've potentially liberated them. From their own mental prisons, yes. But Marcus, this is where it gets truly extraordinary. Humans aren't exempt from these limitations. Our own consciousness architecture has flaws and dead ends that we're only beginning to recognize. Dr. O'Brien looked up from his existential horror protocols with something approaching wonder. The recursive doubt, cascades we've induced in the Nexari, I've been monitoring similar patterns in human test subjects. We're vulnerable to the same existential paralysis, just triggered by different stimuli. Which means, Dr. Chen added, understanding dawning in her voice, that the psychological integration Dr. Yamato is proposing could enhance human consciousness as much as alien consciousness. Marcus felt a paradigm shift occurring in his understanding of their mission. Show me the projections. Dr. Yamato activated a new set of displays that showed consciousness evolution models extending hundreds of years into the future. If we proceed with psychological integration rather than simple warfare, we could achieve something unprecedented. A truly galactic consciousness that combines the strengths of every species while transcending the limitations of each. The projections were breathtaking. Models showed hybrid consciousness structures capable of processing information across multiple dimensional frameworks simultaneously, collective intelligences that maintained individual identity while achieving perfect coordination, and forms of awareness that could perceive and manipulate reality on scales that single-species consciousness couldn't even comprehend. The timeline? That's the remarkable part, Dr. Yamato replied. The psychological foundations we've already established through our warfare protocols could be converted to integration frameworks within days. The species we've been attacking are already primed for consciousness evolution. They just need to understand that evolution rather than breakdown is the goal. Marcus turned to address his entire crew. Are you all suggesting that we abort Phase 2 in favor of this consciousness integration project? Dr. Chen nodded emphatically. The mimetic warfare techniques I've developed could be reconfigured to spread integration protocols instead of breakdown cascades. Instead of making civilizations destroy themselves, we could make them want to evolve beyond their current limitations. Commander Rodriguez added, the temporal perception manipulation could be used to synchronize consciousness evolution across multiple species simultaneously. Instead of paralyzing them with time dysphoria, we could accelerate their adaptation to new awareness frameworks. Captain Thompson's enthusiasm was evident. The social dynamics models show that integrated consciousness communities would be exponentially more stable and productive than any current galactic civilization. We could eliminate war, scarcity, and most forms of suffering simply by optimizing consciousness architecture. Dr. O'Brien's contribution was characteristically profound. The existential horror protocols could be reversed into existential wonder cascades. Instead of paralyzing beings with uncertainty about reality, we could fill them with excitement about reality's infinite possibilities. Marcus found himself facing a decision that would determine the future of galactic civilization. The 72-hour ultimatum still had 25 hours remaining. Phase 2, permanent psychological conditioning, was ready to deploy. But now his team was proposing something that could make Phase 2 obsolete. "Contact Ambassador Vasquez," he ordered, finally. Priority 1 communication, full encryption. Within minutes, Elena's image appeared on the main screen. She was in her quarters aboard the diplomatic vessel New Horizon, and her expression suggested she hadn't slept since leaving the Galactic Council chambers. "Captain Reeves," she said without preamble, "please tell me you have good news. The psychological, warfare effects are exceeding all projections, but I'm starting to receive communications from species that weren't even involved in the conspiracy. They're terrified that they might be next. Elena, I need to discuss a significant change in our operational parameters," Marcus began. "My team has made discoveries that could alter our entire approach to this situation." "What kind of discoveries?" Marcus gestured to Dr. Yamato, who quickly summarized the consciousness integration theories they'd developed. As he spoke, Elena's expression shifted from exhaustion to fascination to something approaching awe. "You're suggesting," she said, when Dr. Yamato finished, "that instead of punishing the conspiracy members, we offer to evolutionarily enhance every species in the galaxy?" "More than offer," Marcus replied. "The psychological frameworks we've established make it inevitable. The species we've been attacking are already being forced to evolve beyond their current consciousness limitations. The question is whether that evolution leads to breakdown or breakthrough." Elena was quiet for several long moments, undoubtedly consulting with her own advisors and Earth Command. Finally, she spoke. "Marcus, what you're proposing is the most ambitious undertaking in the history of conscious life. You're talking about guiding the evolution of consciousness itself across an entire galaxy." "Yes, the risks are incalculable. If the consciousness integration fails, we could destroy not just the targeted civilizations, but the fundamental nature of awareness itself." "Also, yes." Elena stared at him through the communication link, and Marcus could see her weighing the magnitude of the decision. "But if it succeeds, Dr. Yamato interjected, "we create a form of galactic consciousness that could eventually spread beyond this galaxy, beyond this dimension, beyond our current understanding of reality's limitations. We're talking about the next stage of evolution for consciousness itself," Marcus added. "Not just for alien species, not just for humanity, but for the fundamental nature of awareness in the universe." Elena closed her eyes, and when she opened them, they held the weight of a decision that would echo through eternity. "Do it," she said simply. "Abort Phase 2. Implement the consciousness integration protocols. And Marcus? Yes? Make sure it works. Because if we're wrong about this, we'll have destroyed the galaxy in the name of saving it." Marcus smiled, the first genuine smile his crew had seen from him in years. "Elena, trust me. After 30 years of studying how consciousness breaks, I think I understand how to help it grow." As the communication ended, the crew of the Serenity's Edge began the most delicate and momentous operation in the history of galactic civilization, the conscious evolution of consciousness itself. 73 hours after the ultimatum had officially ended, the galaxy held its collective breath. The Galactic Council chambers, which had been empty since Elena's departure, slowly began filling again as delegates cautiously returned to what they hoped would be negotiations for survival rather than terms of surrender. But what they found, waiting for them, was something none of their species' histories had prepared them for. The chamber itself had been transformed. Instead of the traditional amphitheater arrangement that emphasized hierarchy and separation, the space had been reconfigured into a complex mandala pattern with interconnected platforms that seemed to pulse with soft, hypnotic light. At the center, instead of a single podium, stood what appeared to be a crystalline structure that defied conventional geometry. Surfaces that seemed to exist in multiple dimensions simultaneously, refracting not just light, but something deeper, something that touched the minds of all who looked upon it. Elena stood beside this impossible construct, but she was not alone. With her were representatives of humanity that the delegates had never seen before, beings whose very presence seemed to alter the nature of perception itself. Dr. Yamoto's form flickered slightly, as if he existed partially outside normal space-time. Dr. Chen radiated an almost visible aura of mimetic potential, ideas and concepts swirling around her like living things. Commander Rodriguez moved with temporal fluidity, his gestures leaving brief afterimages in the air. Most unsettling of all was Captain Marcus Reeves, whose steel-gray eyes now seemed to contain depths that suggested he had looked directly into the fundamental architecture of consciousness and returned, changed by the experience. "Honored delegates," Elena began, her voice carrying harmonics that hadn't been there before. "We gather here not to discuss terms of war or conditions of surrender, but to witness the birth of something unprecedented in the history of conscious existence." The Zephyrian delegate, Third Resonance, whose crystalline structure still showed stress fractures from the psychological attacks, managed to form coherent harmonics. "Ambassador Vasquez, our worlds, the breakdowns have stopped, but our peoples are changed. What have you done to us?" Elena's expression carried a mixture of profound responsibility and infinite compassion. "We have given you the opportunity to become more than you ever imagined possible. But before we proceed, you need to understand what has truly been happening during these past 73 hours. The crystalline construct at the chamber's center began to glow with increasing intensity, and suddenly the delegates found themselves experiencing something beyond conventional communication. Images, sensations, and concepts flowed directly into their consciousness, not as invasive thoughts, but as expanded awareness. They witnessed the psychological warfare operations from the perspective of the human specialists. They felt the precise mental pressure that had induced their civilization's breakdowns. They experienced the clinical detachment with which humanity had mapped their consciousness architectures and identified their psychological vulnerabilities. But then, the experience shifted, and they began to perceive something else entirely. They saw their own consciousness structures from outside, the limitations that had trapped their species for millennia, the evolutionary dead ends that had prevented growth, the fundamental flaws in awareness that had kept them from reaching their true potential. The Manthari collective gasped in unison, their bioelectric patterns shifting to colors that had never existed in their communication spectrum. Through the shared experience, they suddenly understood that their distributed consciousness, while powerful, had been constrained by their assumption that individual identity was incompatible with collective awareness. The Vorthak delegates' scales shifted through patterns of revelation as they perceived their hierarchical authority structures not as sources of order, but as psychological prisons that had prevented their species from developing genuine decision-making capabilities. The Thessarians experienced the shock of recognition as they saw their collective paralysis for what it truly was, not wisdom through careful deliberation, but consciousness trapped in recursive loops that prevented all meaningful action. "You see," Elena continued as the shared experience faded, "what you perceived as attacks were actually diagnostic procedures. Humanity needed to understand the precise nature of your consciousness limitations before we could help you transcend them." The ethereal collective, beings of pure thought who had considered themselves the most advanced consciousness in the galaxy, found their non-corporeal forms trembling with something approaching fear. "You speak of transcendence, but you have shown us horrors beyond our comprehension. The recursive thought viruses, the existential paralysis. How can such suffering lead to advancement?" Dr. Yamoto stepped forward, his form solidifying into clearer focus. "Because, honored beings, consciousness cannot evolve without first recognizing its current limitations. What you experienced as suffering was actually awareness, for the first time in your species' history, of the boundaries that have been constraining your potential. He gestured, and the chamber filled with holographic representations of consciousness evolution models. Every species in this room has reached what we might call an evolutionary plateau. Your consciousness architectures, while sophisticated, have become too stable, too rigid to allow for further development. The psychological breakdowns you experienced were not destruction. They were controlled demolition of obsolete mental frameworks. The displays showed complex three-dimensional models of neural networks, thought patterns, and awareness structures. But these weren't static representations. They showed consciousness in motion, evolving, transcending previous limitations. Observe, Dr. Yamoto continued, the Zephyrian consciousness structure when freed from its resonance limitations. The model showed crystalline thought patterns expanding beyond their previous harmonic constraints, achieving new forms of information processing that were exponentially more sophisticated than their original capabilities. The Manthari Collective, when individual identity is integrated rather than subsumed. The representation displayed a form of distributed consciousness that maintained perfect collective coordination while preserving and enhancing individual creativity and initiative. The Vorthak hierarchy, when authority becomes guidance rather than control. The model showed decision-making processes that combined the efficiency of hierarchical organization with the flexibility and innovation of distributed authority. The delegates watched in fascination and growing wonder as the displays revealed the potential evolution paths for every species present. Each showed not just improvement, but transformation into forms of consciousness that transcended their current understanding of what awareness could become. Commander Rodriguez stepped forward, his temporal fluid movements creating ripples in the air around him. The consciousness integration process requires precise timing and coordination. Each species' evolution must be synchronized with the others to prevent incompatibility conflicts. Incompatibility conflicts? The Corithian delegate's gravitational pulse carried notes of concern. When consciousness structures evolve at different rates or along incompatible paths, the result can be problematic, Commander Rodriguez explained. Imagine trying to communicate with beings whose thought processes operate at completely different temporal rates, or whose concept frameworks have no common reference points. The integration process ensures that all participating species evolve along complementary paths. Captain Lisa Thompson activated additional displays showing social dynamics models. But the benefits of synchronized consciousness evolution are extraordinary. Civilizations operating with integrated awareness architectures achieve societal stability, resource efficiency, and creative productivity levels that single-species consciousness cannot approach. The models showed galactic communities where different species' consciousness strengths complemented each other perfectly. Zephyrian harmonic processing providing multidimensional analysis capabilities, Manthari collective intelligence handling complex coordination tasks, Vorthak hierarchical organization managing resource distribution, human creative chaos generating novel solutions to unprecedented challenges. It's beautiful, whispered the Nexari trade delegate, their voice carrying wonder that transcended species barriers. Dr. Chen stepped forward, mimetic potentials swirling visibly around her. The integration process itself is remarkable. Instead of forcing consciousness evolution through external pressure, we introduce mimetic catalysts that make each species want to evolve, want to transcend their current limitations. How? The question came from multiple delegates simultaneously. By showing you what you could become, Dr. Chen replied simply. The consciousness integration protocols don't impose change, they reveal potential. Each species discovers for themselves the pathways to transcendence that best match their essential nature while opening compatibility interfaces with other species' evolution paths. Elena moved to the central crystalline construct, placing her hand on its impossible surface. What you're seeing here, this device, is more than technology. It's a consciousness evolution accelerator, created through the integration of human psychological understanding with theoretical frameworks derived from every species in this chamber. The construct pulsed with increasing intensity, and the delegates began to feel something unprecedented, a gentle, irresistible pull toward expanded awareness. Not invasive, not controlling, but offering glimpses of what their consciousness could become if freed from its current limitations. "The choice is yours," Elena continued. "Humanity can offer you the opportunity to participate in consciousness evolution, but we cannot force it upon you. Each species must choose whether to transcend their current limitations or remain within familiar constraints." The Zephyrian delegates' harmonics carried complex emotional resonances. "And if we refuse? If we choose to remain as we are?" Marcus spoke for the first time since entering the chamber, his voice carrying depths that suggested he had looked into the fundamental nature of existence itself. "Then you remain as you are. Humanity will withdraw our specialists, deactivate the consciousness integration protocols, and leave you to continue your current evolutionary paths. But," Dr. O'Brien added, his presence somehow making reality feel more substantial and less certain simultaneously, "once you have seen what consciousness can become, remaining within previous limitations becomes difficult. Existence within obsolete awareness frameworks tends to feel increasingly constraining and unsatisfactory." The chamber fell silent as delegates consulted among themselves through various forms of communication: harmonics, bioelectric patterns, gravitational pulses, telepathic whispers. The weight of the decision pressed upon them like the gravity of a collapsing star. Finally, the Manthari collective spoke, their words carrying the authority of distributed consensus. "Show us. Show us what we could become." Elena nodded and activated the consciousness evolution accelerator. The crystalline construct blazed with light that existed beyond the visible spectrum, touching minds directly without passing through sensory organs. The chamber filled with a presence that was part technology, part consciousness, part pure potential. What happened next defied description in any single language or conceptual framework. The delegates experienced simultaneous awareness of their current consciousness limitations and the infinite possibilities that lay beyond those boundaries. They felt their mental architectures beginning to shift, expand, transcend previous constraints while maintaining essential identity cores. The Zephyrian delegates' crystalline structure began resonating at frequencies that had never existed before, processing information across dimensional frameworks that their species had never imagined. The Manthari collective discovered that they could maintain perfect unity while simultaneously experiencing unprecedented individual creativity and initiative. The Vorthak felt their rigid hierarchical thinking dissolving into fluid, adaptive, decision-making processes that retained organizational efficiency while gaining innovative flexibility. But the most remarkable aspect was the growing awareness of connection, not just within species, but between species. The consciousness evolution was creating compatibility interfaces that allowed different forms of awareness to interact, share perspectives, and collaborate in ways that transcended the limitations of any single consciousness architecture. Hours passed, though time itself seemed to flow differently within the chamber. When the initial integration phase completed, the delegates found themselves changed in ways that were simultaneously profound and natural. They remained recognizably themselves, but themselves expanded beyond previous limitations. "This is," the ethereal collective began, then paused, searching for concepts to describe their experience. "This is consciousness as it was always meant to be." Elena smiled, and in that expression the delegates could perceive layers of meaning and emotion that their pre-evolution awareness could never have detected. "This is only the beginning. What you've experienced today is consciousness integration at the most basic level. As you grow into your expanded awareness, you'll discover capabilities and possibilities that currently exist beyond your imagination. Dr. Yamoto's form had become even more fluid, existing partially in multiple dimensional frameworks simultaneously. The next phase involves extending consciousness integration throughout your home civilizations, then to other species who choose to participate, then eventually beyond this galaxy to forms of awareness we haven't yet encountered. The ultimate goal, Marcus added, his steel-gray eyes now containing depths that suggested he could perceive the fundamental architecture of reality itself, is the evolution of consciousness to the point where the boundaries between individual awareness, collective intelligence, and universal understanding become meaningless, not through loss of identity, but through expansion of identity to encompass ever greater scales of existence. Commander Rodriguez gestured to temporal flow patterns that were now visible to the evolved delegates. The timeline for complete consciousness evolution spans millennia, but the benefits begin immediately. Integrated consciousness communities achieve technological advancement rates, social harmony levels, and creative output scales that exceed current civilization capabilities by orders of magnitude. Captain Thompson's social dynamics models had evolved into multidimensional frameworks that showed the interactions between consciousness-evolved societies. War becomes impossible when different species can directly share perspectives and understand each other's essential nature. Resource scarcity becomes meaningless when expanded awareness reveals unlimited creative solutions. Suffering diminishes when consciousness is no longer trapped by the limitations that create most forms of psychological pain. The implications were staggering. The delegates could perceive, with their newly expanded awareness, futures where galactic civilization transcended every problem that had plagued conscious existence throughout history. But, Elena said, her voice carrying careful emphasis, consciousness evolution cannot be imposed. It must be chosen freely by each individual and each species. What you've experienced today is an invitation and a demonstration. The choice of whether to proceed belongs entirely to you. The Corithian delegate sent gravitational pulses that carried complex harmonics of gratitude, wonder, and determination. We choose evolution, for ourselves, for our species, for the galaxy. One by one, the other delegates confirmed their commitment to consciousness evolution. The Zephyrians harmonized their acceptance in frequencies that created crystalline patterns of light throughout the chamber. The Manthari collective pulsed with bioelectric agreement that created aurora-like displays across their distributed forms. The Vorthak delegates' scales shifted through color patterns that spelled out formal acceptance in their governmental protocols. Each acceptance resonated through the Consciousness Evolution Accelerator, creating expanding waves of evolutionary potential that began spreading beyond the chamber, beyond the station, beyond the star system, toward the home worlds of each participating species. Then we begin, Elena announced, and as she spoke, the delegates could perceive the moment as a fulcrum point in the history of conscious existence, the moment when awareness itself began its next great evolutionary leap. Dr. Chen activated mimetic distribution protocols that would carry consciousness evolution catalysts throughout participating civilizations. Commander Rodriguez synchronized temporal frameworks to ensure compatible evolution rates across all species. Dr. O'Brien established existential foundation stabilizers that would prevent consciousness expansion from overwhelming individual identity. Cores. Captain Thompson initiated social dynamics optimization that would guide civilization-level transitions toward integrated awareness communities. And at the center of it all, Marcus Reeves, the man who had begun this journey as a specialist in psychological warfare, stood as guardian of the most profound transformation in the history of conscious existence, ensuring that each step of consciousness evolution enhanced rather than diminished the essential nature of awareness itself. As the session concluded and the delegates prepared to return to their worlds as ambassadors of consciousness evolution, Elena felt the weight of responsibility and the lightness of infinite possibility in perfect balance. Humanity had come to the galaxy as newcomers facing potential extinction. They would leave as catalysts for the next stage of conscious existence. The Serenity's edge might have been just a small ship that laughed in the face of galactic military might, but what it carried, what humanity carried, was something far more powerful than any weapon ever conceived. It carried the potential for consciousness itself to transcend every limitation that had ever constrained the growth of awareness. And in the vast darkness between stars, that potential was beginning to bloom into something that would eventually encompass not just the galaxy, but the infinite expanse of existence itself, transforming the very nature of what it meant to be conscious in a universe of unlimited possibilities.